Amanda said, will you be able to do something really? So it's pretty fortunate, I think. What I intend to do is, just like Amanda outlined there, is have about an hour where we'll go through some of the key things, if you have any questions or any thoughts at all, or I think it's rubbish, fire it into the chat, just, get it in there. We'll pick up those as part of a discussion for the last half hour or so. My understanding is the discussion won't be recorded, so feel free, however you wish to make that point. And just a reminder, if you just joined, that Amanda did say if you do want to switch your videos off during this recorded bit, that might be your preference, but obviously no problems at all. So this, in essence, is a piece of work that I did for a conference last year, which was specifically about refocusing this sort of debate around what people might call challenging behaviour. But I think potentially, particularly for youngsters and young people who have autism diagnoses or maybe have diagnosis of ADHD, where we might determine it more distressed behaviour and changing the dynamic in how we think about this. And so I thought this would be quite an interesting thing, and Amanda seemed to think so as well. So I hope that people that are online now and people that listen on record are okay. It's probably useful to start with that I'm not actually in a sauna. This is my sort of shed in the garden that I've been working from for 12 months. Although last May it was pretty much like a sauna, which added a lot of challenge. And just to quickly reframe the fact that I've spent 25 years working in schools, 17 of which as a secondary SENCO, doing a lot of research and support. And I've also been very fortunate to work with schools in South America, the UAE, and in Portugal, as well as in Ireland, the UK, and Scandinavia, and coupled a lot of that with my last 10 years as being a SENCO. So, I've been very, very fortunate to work with a lot of settings on supporting their journey in changing some of these dynamics and narratives. So hopefully some of my experience and the things that I've been involved with will be of interest to you. As far as I'm concerned, Amanda can send you this as an unlocked PowerPoint, and you can use it yourselves and adapt it how you wish. For me, I just want to try and make some positive impact somehow. So hopefully that's okay. Now, quite often I can go at quite a pace, so it's probably a good job it's being recorded, because you might want to play it back and pause it. And I realise sometimes when I'm tired, I go even faster like a runaway train. So I'm going to try really hard to have some self-control myself today. So I think when I first started doing this, I thought, really, what is behaviour? And I think when you type this into Google, you get all sorts of interesting definitions. And these are a few that came up. Behaviour, the actions or mannerisms made by individuals, organisms, systems, or artificial intelligences and entities in conjunction with yourselves and the environment. Okay. And I think this is really important, because one of the things I'm going to talk about at the end is a project that I've developed with Professor Andy McDonnell, and is the majority of my training, called the Laser Project, where we look at how we can do things to support adaptations and changes in the environment and with the adults and other people that are in it to allow individuals to flourish. So a lot of this will be about trying to look at external things that are within our gift to change so that we allow individuals to flourish, not trying to normalize a disabled young person into somebody else's prescription in a way. So we all have responses to external stimuli, and those could be physical things, if it gets too hot, too noisy, if it's too much of an open space or whatever, but also the other people we're interacting in. And I think that's really important to understand. And this is the subtlety, I think, and I think people make a lot of assumptions, that particularly at moments of crisis, that people are in control or aware of what's happening. And the reality is, when you're completely dysregulated and your stresses are outweighing your ability to cope, you're not really able to respond to things, particularly purely verbal instructions at those point of times. So what we want to try and do is flip this narrative, as our colleague Ellie Chappell talks about, and change this dynamic. So the whole idea of everything I've done, and I'll highlight a few things that you might want to follow up on from the session, is about being really proactive in our thinking. And to be proactive, you have to be a reflective practitioner. So you need to think about what's happened, and then have or structure within that setting about how we move things forward. that makes sense next time. Okay, so some of the causes or some of the challenges, and I think, again, this is more subtle than X equals Y, but actually if an individual is struggling to communicate their needs, and this could be a pre-verbal learner, it could be a learner who has a communication aid, a bit of technology and the battery's not working that day and it's really frustrating, or it could be somebody that for whom the ability to communicate and articulate in verbal language is difficult, and the teacher that's with them that day or the member of support staff isn't familiar with their communication system, for example. If we're confused about things, unexpected changes in routine, environmental factors. If you've ever been in a tube station or a train station in London and the noise is bouncing around, there's hundreds of people there, obviously pre-pandemic era, it's a pretty difficult place to be, I think, at the best of times, The association of pain and medical needs, inactivity or boredom, lots of demands and requests. One thing we talk about a lot is that a lot of extreme challenges and moments of dysregulation are preceded by demands and requests. So very simply, reducing demands and particularly verbal requests automatically reduces the challenges that may present. Too many rules and restrictions. I think simple is always best. Okay, so when I started teaching in the 90s in a pretty challenging secondary school in the Northwest, I remember there were sort of 9 year 9 students. I had 3 extra adults in the room. And I was a 21-year-old newly qualified teacher. I'm thinking, this is fantastic. 3 extra adults, there's only 9 kids in here. After a couple of lessons, what I realized I should have been saying is, why are there 3 other people in this room? It was quite obvious. And the reality is we had one rule, that only one person spoke at any one time. And what that allowed us to do was to calmly reinforce what we would call a low arousal approach, which I'll talk about now, where we're creating this calm, purposeful, clear environment for learning, and simple rules allow you to support that consistently. And I think this is part of the craft, if that makes sense, in schools of teaching, but also supported by the whole school approach, which is the leadership and management way of ensuring that happens. So we'll talk about this as we go through. But the whole key to this, I want us to really get this in our mind if we can, it's about being less reactive and more proactive. And the more proactive we are, the less reactive we need to be. Right now, this sounds obvious, doesn't it? But I dare say some people online have been very much involved in reactive systems and structures in the past. And being reflective and having trust within people that are working is so important. And the way we would sum this up is a quote from David Petoniak. And if you're not aware of his work, I would suggest you have a little look at it. But, when somebody's drowning is not the best time to teach them how to swim. I think too often reactive systems are trying to change behavior at a point of crisis. And actually, that is the worst time to try and do it. People take longer to process things. Often they're not in a position because of the moment of dysregulation. So at moments of crisis, we just need to try and get somebody less stressed at that point in time. And I think if we're trying to change behavior, like go to the head's office, stop doing that, stop strangling your sister, wherever that might be, often what we're doing is just adding our state of arousal to an already stressed individual. And the key is always to try and do less at those points of crisis. And these are things you can practice and you can actively do and change. And this is something we do quite a bit of. Quite a lot of my training at the moment is about actively training people about things to do at those times to not add their own state of arousal to an already challenging situation. So we'll touch on some of those things. So I think just thinking particularly about school settings, but also other settings, I think we think particularly about some of the young people we work with. School and learning is a very complex language environment, and there's lots of things we have to do or we expect young people to do about changing and understanding things in different contexts. So a good example of this is an analogy that a colleague and friend of mine, Peter Van Meulen, uses about what he calls context blindness. So if you're arriving to a set of pedestrian lights and there's the red person there, you press the button, you wait till that turns green, and then you progress across the road. Fantastic. Red means stay there, green means walk across. Okay, so next time I arrive at the lights and it's a green person. So I walk onto the road, take one pace, and it turns red. Now, what I do in that situation is think, oh, I'm not going to make it. I'll go back and press the button. And similarly, if I make it 3/4 of the way across and it turns red, I might think, well, I'll just rush on. I can make this. So already I've interpreted the red man as stop, go back, and rush on, depending upon the context in which I experience that red man. Now, actually, we assume that everybody can do this, and this is difficult. Okay, and it's particularly difficult for young people who are having fewer coping responses because of different starting points in life, diagnosis, circumstances, etc. So if you're in a school canteen and you've told everybody they need to line up through the queuing system to go and get their lunch, and a young person goes at lunch and they're a little bit tight to the time when everybody's coming, and the teacher says, "You haven't got time to queue today, come on, just get to the front, hurry up," adds to it, doesn't it? The stresses of it, and we're changing the context all the time. So simple, consistent routines and structures in schools are really important. And that's where reflective, because actually, if we're thinking about that sort of situation in the canteen, what we might want to do is actually not leaving 5 minutes early for lunch, but perhaps that young person needs to leave 8 minutes early. So that chance of that is less. Okay, you can't eliminate these things, but you can do a heck of a lot to change the dynamic within them. And also, just at the bottom there, where some people talk about managing behaviour, I would talk very much about the fact that actually, if you eliminate the word behaviour from systems and school structures, and we talk much more about stress, immediately we're into a solution-focused discourse. So if we're thinking about the stresses people have, talking with young people and families about how we reduce those and what they are, and actively teaching coping responses, which could be breathing exercises, various other strategies and things like that, we can change that dynamic. And so in having this language and perhaps implementing stress support plans for some of our learners, which is part of this metacognitive discussion, immediately we're flipping that narrative. We're changing the dynamic into a solution-focused way of working. And this really, if we're particularly listening from England, fits in with the Children and Families Act and keeping the young people and families central to it, because it's part of that collaboration as we go. And so it's difficult to explain too much in detail in a little hours session, but I'll highlight where you can find out more as well as we go forward. And just very quickly, I think the biggest and most successful thing we ever did at school was a real focus on education of the peer group. You know, I think other kids are inherently kind and supportive, and I think it's a big untapped resource. So how you use assemblies and whole school pastoral events to support diversity and difference, and how our curriculum supports that as well, I think is really important. And that's got to be about training and support and things as well. So just coming on to the sort of idea of low arousal, it was developed by Professor Andy McDonald so in the 80s and 90s, but was in essence a sort of crisis management tool at that time. Now, what I try and do, since I've been working with Studio 3 for the last couple of years, is draw on some of the elements of the low arousal approach and apply those to some of my own research and work, so that it's more proactive. And I think sometimes the best proactive strategies are learnt from situations where we've had to react. But then as we get more experienced and more confident in what we're doing, we're able to apply those more systemically, if that makes sense, within structures. So, you know, very much about reducing staff demands at the point of crisis, adopting verbal and non-verbal strategies that avoid arousing triggers. You know, you don't need to be looking at somebody to listen to them. Exploring staff beliefs about the short-term understanding of this. You know, if people don't understand the strategy, we don't actively teach them to staff and families, it's going to be difficult for people to do. And we've got to support staff in that with reflective supervision in effect. And so very simple things that we would actively teach, you know, at moments of crisis, actually, let's just take 2 steps back. Let's slow our movements down. Let's be really aware of our stresses impacting on others. And there's loads of stuff that you can actively do and practice that change that dynamic. And then if that individual, who may be your child or a young person in the home or somebody in the classroom or something, has fewer times when they are outweighed stresses to coping responses and in moments of crisis, then you get more time when you can talk with young people and proactively work on the systems together. Because trying to change that sort of point and the situation at the point of crisis is the wrong time to do it. So we want to slowly work on changing that balance so that then we can be more collaborative and co-produce some of these solutions. And in essence, nobody fights when they're relaxed and easygoing. So if we create these calm, purposeful, very clear, structured environments for learning and participation and spaces in the home, etc., actually, it's much less likely that this sort of human response of fight or flight will kick in. So calm and self-control are definitely connected. And virtually every time we do training and talk about this, and the same with myself, you know, people think back and say, well, I've been doing that for years. And actually, the best practitioners of these approaches are just naturally those sort of people. You know, but I think the key about work we would be doing is that you can actively teach a lot of these things to people. So people who aren't so naturally just like this actually can learn to be like this. And I think that's the key thing. You know, we can all learn, and, you know, I learn every day. I would never, ever profess to be an expert in everything. I think I have some experience, but every day I work with a young person or a family or talk to a head teacher or whatever, you learn something new, and it's about building up that sort of structure and the understanding that I think makes a big difference. And for me, you know, the research might say, oh, you know, only works with 2% of the population, but if that's one of the young people that I'm working with, well, let's do it. You know what I mean? We need to be flexible and understand the needs for reasonable adjustments. And we also need providing appropriate training and support. You can't expect somebody to do something if they haven't been supported in understanding it. And people don't know what they don't know, you know, which is key. So these are a few slides from a blog that I've just written. I'll put the links in the PowerPoint as well, about what I term constant consistency. And this is, in essence, drawing from a lot of my experience, particularly in international schools. And I think, you know, a big American international school in Chile that I've worked with is very different to a small rural primary school in Derbyshire. However, actually core ideas and structures feed through this narrative of any setting, really. So, you know, I think problems arise when there isn't this whole school approach. If we have fragmented provision, it increases stress, really, okay? And so, you know, pockets of good practice or a really good lesson there, and then a really moment of dysregulation at break time or lunchtime isn't helpful for an individual as they progress through the day. So, you know, it's no good having a really calm, consistent, purposeful learning environment in one classroom. If then the bell goes, it's like a flipping stampede, you know, front of Jumanji. Have you seen that? Where they're... Or when we could fly, do you remember, you had speedy boarding on EasyJet? It was just that you were in the front of the queue of everybody rushing anyway. You know, that doesn't help anybody. So actually, very simple things are often the best solutions. Virtually, I don't know, 80% of schools I've worked with, get rid of the bells. You know, just get rid of the bells, let people look at the time, just let people calmly flow, yeah? It just, you know, if we have that moment of big highs and lows of stress and tension, you create this dysregulation and you fuel this. It's also stressful for staff because they're stop running. Oh, don't do that. Everybody's being reactive. So the more proactive we can be and the better we can get this flow through the education of the day. And this is where with co-production is important because we work with home, understand transitions, etc., etc. It makes a massive difference. And this is the key to it. So consistency has to be constant for good learning to take place. And, you know, we are all human, okay? So I've been there on a Friday afternoon exhausted, where I've just had a terrible lesson with people because I'm tired, yeah? So actually, on reflection, I need to think about what is realistic for me to achieve on that day and how we can do it, how I can support my week. And this is where good leadership supports the balance of tasks to give staff the best opportunity with this. And the same with families, you know, there's massive pressure points with families at different times. So the work we do with families is very much looking at that flow through the experience and how we can support that. So one of the key elements of this is the saturation model, which I'll talk a little bit about as we go through the session. But in essence, nobody is harmed by calm, consistent, positive approaches. And that's the best thing as far as the environment and what we want to achieve. Okay, so the key to this for me is very much talking with families and young people. Okay. I think too often people think they are co-producing something by professionals assuming what the challenges are and then just bringing people on board when they've decided what they're going to do. You know, what we need to do is really work with people right from the start. And this is this idea of engaging in metacognitive discussions. So having pockets of the calm time and then massive peaks and troughs of, you know, dysregulation and really stressful times isn't good for anybody. Okay, so we want to try and create this consistent approach across the whole day, if that makes sense. So, you know, if you're in a peaceful lesson before lunch, it's a fantastic atmosphere. The teacher's got a great way of working. It's really clear how the lesson progresses, etc. But I know in 20 minutes time, it's going to be lunch and it's absolute carnage. I'm really stressed about that. You know, probably that last half hour of the lesson, I'm not really performing to my best because I'm thinking about how can I deal with that? You know, and that can be exhausting. So you get the situation where people mask in school, they're putting all their energy into it. And then, of course, when they get home, there's nothing left, you know. So it's really important to consider young people's experience over the whole day. You know, otherwise we fuel this sort of narrative, oh, they're all right in school, no idea what's happening there. And then you create these issues with emotional regulation where stressors outweigh ability to cope as people get tired. Because at the end of the day, tiredness is one of the most significant factors in your ability to cope or not. And I think we're probably, everyone online would know, when you've had a poor sleep or you've got a cold or you've got hay fever or whatever, you are probably less able to cope than when you've had a good sleep, you're feeling pretty fresh, etc., etc. Okay, so I always talk a lot about what's within our gift to change, you know, and as, you know, an individual, depending on your role in an organization or as a parent trying to engage with different professionals, there are certain things that are going to be within your gift to change and certain things you think, well, you need to do this, but actually putting all your energy into trying to do that might mean that you get ill and then you're not able to do something. So I always think it's the starting point is understanding what is possible. If that makes sense. And then when we start shifting that ball and changing that culture, then we can build on things as we go forward. So, you know, talking to young people and families and the experience of the whole day, this idea of co-production, I've written a lot about that. That's really important, I think. So it has to involve young people and families from the start in identifying those things. I think then we have to work collaboratively on how you formulate that approach. And in essence, this is about really people, you know, allowing the sharing of and the passage of power. And I think where we want to, as professionals, always maintain that powerful relationship over others, then we lose great opportunities, I think. And it doesn't mean to say you're weak. You know, I'm probably one of the highest standards of people as far as things and expectations ever, but it means is we're redefining that relationship, how we move forward. So rather than adults or professionals assuming what's needed, we gather robust information about those plans and provisions. So you might get in a school system where this secondary school lad has got 932 behaviour points. And I was thinking, well, what's that mean? What does that mean? You know, and actually the data they collect doesn't tell me what I need to know, which is 852 of those are in the lesson before lunch. Right, okay, let's not go to the lesson before lunch for a fortnight. Let's have a look. It's only had 52 behaviour points. That's interesting. We lost 900 behaviour points by simply not going to that lesson before lunch. Right, let's look now, when that person's calm, about how we support a re-engagement with learning at that time, or maybe change the dynamic or stuff we do to try and get a better way forward. I think too often school systems don't collect the information we need to be analytical about how we find ways forward. And you know, it's really important we understand that based on the community, and we don't have assumptions and preconceptions. So sometimes a really small change like that can make a massive difference. Because I would imagine if that young person, as an example, was having 800 behaviour issues before lunch, I would imagine lunchtime is probably quite challenging as well. You know, and that, you know, you get this catalogue and this knock-on effect. But you don't know that if you don't collect the right information. So a lot of schools I would work with actually have systems that don't provide the information they need to make active, positive decisions in this proactive model. Okay. Secondly, high quality teaching and learning. Okay. The core business of any school is obviously teaching and learning in essence, and providing good, calm, consistent, robust learning environments is really important. And we talk quite a lot in the laser program I've developed about you know, the advances in cognitive science, good strategies for that, because that's really important. And I think good school settings are where the teaching and learning faculty or whoever's in charge of that, the deputy head or whoever, really develops this idea of inclusive ways of working. Because a good teaching and learning strategy is good for all. You know, good strategies for young people with additional learning needs are good and don't harm other peers, if that makes sense. So there's a growing body of evidence in that, and great teaching for everybody has to be the core element of this. And actually, if somebody's never in the lesson, they can't access the great teaching. So no intervention makes up for poor quality teaching. So, you know, if people are leaving a maths lesson to have numeracy interventions, I think there's something a bit wrong in the way we're approaching things, if that makes sense. And thirdly, ensuring that whole school policy and systems are calm and consistent. When you sign into a building or you go and visit somewhere, you get a feel for it, you know, and I think different schools and different settings have different challenges. So if you're in a very old listed building that can't be changed much, it's very different from one of the brand new schools in Dubai that I've worked with beautiful outside spaces on each classroom and things like that. So we've got to be realistic about that, but that's about being solution focused within it. Getting rid of the bells, orderly transitions, staff eating lunch with the students, I think, and modeling the appropriate behavior. All of this feeds into what I call this corporate responsibility model. And these are all things we've done and we found, you know, significant positives from, and also things that I've worked with in a number of schools on short-term, but also longer-term plans across many different countries, really, which I've been very fortunate to do. So from recent experience in international settings particularly, I know that there are very simple things that can be changed that have massive impact. So there was a school, two schools in Dubai I've been working with, where one of the schools had the schools come in and they're in lessons at like 8 o'clock in the morning, and at 10 o'clock they have a break, and at break time, everybody runs out, they're all running around, you know, super excited and things like that. And then the deputy head was sort of saying to me, well, it takes us 20 minutes to get everybody calm again after that break time. So I'm not surprised. If you cook people up for 2 hours of solid learning after some of them have had an hour's journey, so some of these 7-year-olds are getting up at 6, having an hour in a taxi, 2 hours learning, then they're let out. I said, what you want to try and do is break up how the lesson times and the breaks happen so you get a better flow through the day. And the structure wasn't allowing that to happen. Now, it wasn't a big issue for them because, you know, it was a fantastic school. But simply adjusting some of that flow through learning makes a big difference, massive difference. So approaches that assume what the challenges are, I think are where the issues arise, really. We want to actively have processes to look at how we engage young people and families right from the start. And this is about personalisation, in essence, you know, remembering that every environment and community is unique. You know, as I said, a small primary school in Aurora, a massive, some of the massive international all through schools that I've worked with are very different, but a lot of the key themes are the same. And actually, if you create that calm, purposeful environment, you know, nobody's armed from that, you know. And so I talk a little bit about this idea of corporate responsibility in the chapter I wrote in this book that's edited by David Bartram. And again, I think if you're in a position of sort of school leadership or aspiring to that, I would recommend that. There's some good essays in there that are quite useful. But in essence, what we want to try and do is create this caring environment that's really characterized by calm, positive expectations that are about decreasing stresses and therefore the challenges that may result when the stresses are too much to cope with. You know, and I think, again, you know, challenging behaviour as a word has a lot of things to unpick with. So I think, again, there's a reframing of this. And I suppose, yeah, I'm really conscious of everything I do in the fact that I change my mind a lot, you know, and I think, yeah, I might have thought that 2 years ago, but now I'd say this, you know what I mean? And I think that's really important within this. So in essence, calm and self-control are connected. Applying this sort of low arousal approach to teaching and learning is about the culture within the classroom. It's founded on this understanding of stress and consistent proactive approaches. So we maintain this calm, consistent environment by applying the evidence that we have. And we need the right information to support that, which is where obviously key people and discussions with families and specialist professionals and things is so important within that. So creating this calm, consistent, positive learning environment benefits everybody. And a good strategy for young people with additional needs rarely, if ever, harms or hinders peers. So actually, if we frame our systems and our teaching and learning around the young people, where we have to consider doing things a little bit differently or making positive adaptations and looking about those reasonable adjustments, it doesn't harm other people. So it makes complete sense to me, you know, and I think as well, I would argue that it's very much possible. So part of what I've been doing the last 2 years really is developing this laser program, drawing on my research in the saturation model and whole school approaches to create this bespoke program for schools where we sort of train people and support people in different elements of it, and then ideally would support them in implementing those specifically to their setting, or allow some more intensive work with some key staff in there so that they can provide that self-development model themselves. And just a quick slide of the saturation model. So this was developed over a 4-year period, and we published it 10 years ago. So again, Professor Neil Humphrey messaged me the other day saying, you're getting some mileage out of that. I said, because actually it does make a difference, Neil. So, let's just relax about it. And that is the man, Professor Humphrey, that wrote the foreword to one of my training packs. And when he got his complimentary copy, he used it as a door prop to wedge the door open. So I knew this would come in handy. So, it's always nice to have the support of your colleagues, isn't it? This was developed where we were working with autistic young people who had been permanently excluded or non-attending schools. The whole idea of the model was that it supported re-engagement with learning. And our success rate within this was the fact that every child went on to education, employment or training at 16. So actually, the pathway into adulthood was the success of this. Now, there's loads you can read more about that, and I haven't really got time in the hour to go into real detail about the different elements of this. But the school environment is not just the physical environment. Like we said with context before and the understanding of language, it is the communication environment, the emotional environment as well. And understanding the need for flexible provision within that, it was a key part of it. As I said, there's lots of things. You type in the saturation model, you get tons on that. You can get the paper off my website as well. And there's a few videos on the Studio 3 website if you're really interested in finding a bit more about that. But two colleagues I've been fortunate to work with in the past, describe really, I suppose, what the philosophy or the ideas that underpin what I'm trying to think about. Schools where difference is valued. There's less emphasis on conformity, but greater emphasis on harnessing the strengths in order to allow all staff and students alike to be the best they can become. And Damien talks a lot about this idea of personalisation, not normalisation. And I think the mistake people have is they think personalisation is some like free-for-all or some kind of commune or something where everybody does whatever they want. You need good structure and consistency to allow personalisation to succeed. If you don't have that, then personalisation just doesn't work. So actually the structure and consistency and the calm approach has to be the first thing that we establish as part of this whole school approach. And I think, sometimes people, particularly on social media and things just like snippets and little bits that are out of context, I think you need the context to allow the specifics to be developed. And when I think back to when I did my master's degree in the 90s, thinking about the sort of stuff Michelin Mason did on disability equality and the real social model of thinking really is like the sort of the core elements, like a stick of rock, I suppose, running through everything I've done. Outcome-based design, identifying barriers and developing solutions jointly. Really evolving what we do as part of a reflective model. I think it's really important, not seeing the young person or the systems as a problem and then saying we can't cope in essence. So, in essence, it's about understanding how we apply things, very clear understanding of stress, and improving classroom pedagogy, but also understanding this idea that a strong pillar of all this has to be strong co-production. And that, for some, that relocation of power within those relationships is really difficult for some people. I would never presume that people are open to doing things differently. As I say, I change my mind all the time. When I first went to Chile in 2016, where they brought in an inclusion law, we were talking to 60 head teachers, all white men in their 50s and 60s, saying, "Oh, isn't this brilliant?" That wasn't a very receptive audience, let's put it that way. You probably had 57 of them were going, "Never, why am I listening to this idiot?" You had a couple that took us to one side, "Well, we believe you, but we'd never say that." And there was one head, he stood up and said, "I want you to come to my school, Gareth." And he'd been head for 37 years and was really important in that journey for Chile. When I went back a few years later, it was noticeably different. So again, I think the connection between policy and practice, like we said in the saturation model, is important. So some of the key areas that we talk on is the saturation model, low arousal approaches, positive psychology. If we're not positive about making a difference, who is? Co-production, stress and arousal, being a reflective practitioner and understanding the importance of metacognition, self-regulation. And I talk quite a lot in longer sessions about, if metacognition and self-regulation are good teaching and learning strategies, but they're also good self-strategies, if we put quite a bit of effort into understanding how we apply those strategies within a school setting, it helps everything because it cuts across home and school, social and learning, all those different elements. It improves the self within the system. So positive psychology, a good colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Pookie Knight-Smith, religiously does sort of 3 good things, reframing things at the end of the night. And rather than just focusing on negatives, if we can actively say, well, these are 3 good things we've done and write them down, you can change that dynamic. And over time, we might identify things that we should be doing more of anyway. So again, I think, it's vital when we think about this that we really try and personalize responses. Personalization isn't just about individuals, it's about communities and families as well. And I think that's really, really important to understand. And again, I think this is a good example of where people don't really understand what outcomes are, don't really understand the process of proper co-production and pick on little bits and then make a sort of bit of a hash of it, really. So I always like to be quite clear. And I think one of the things I would say was one of my better elements as a leader was distilling absolute actionable things that people needed to do as part of a longer term progress for change. So positive examples between classroom routines and structured things are really important. Knowing students individually, being aware of those with additional needs. Common practice, I would argue, that's good is greeting students at the door, establishing positive routines and structures for learning that are consistent. Planning explicitly with timings and sticking to that, showing progression to reduce uncertainty, reducing stress by being positive in our structures and actively engaging in discussions. These are all things that I think are very achievable and I think, again, are very possible. Some people just get them, and some people you can provide some additional coaching and support to develop those. One of the things I think we talk quite a bit in the longer training is what we call planned escape. And I just put a little few links in there so you can have a look at in your leisure. But in essence, if I'm in a difficult situation, human response is to fight or flight, or sometimes I might freeze. So if I'm a cave person, a saber-toothed tiger jumps over and I got my spear, I'm either going to try and kill it probably or run off, or, if I freeze, that's probably the end of me. But that's a human response. So when young people are highly stressed, sometimes they will run. Right. And actually, if we restrict young people, and I think it's really important to understand that restrictive practices aren't always physically restraining people. If you're in a primary school setting and all the door handles are head height for adults and you are escaping because you're highly stressed, but you can't get out, you're bouncing off these doors that are all shut, we're just adding and restricting that young person further. So if we know somebody's likely to do that, when we're calm in the stress support plan, we talk about the needs and the strategies they do, and we sit that person by the fire door, prop it open, and then when they're highly stressed, they just leave and go out to the field, and then a member of staff calmly just keeps an eye. The school's got a big perimeter fence, there's not going to be any bother there, the rest of the class just calmly continue. So rather than denying people their response at that time, we facilitate that as part of our program. So, I don't think people would take a wheelchair off somebody or a hearing aid, so you've got to manage without that stay, but often I think there are unintended consequences that deny people their support mechanism at that time that's really important. And so in doing this, we need to be reflective practitioners. We need to consider what we're thinking about and be mindful of those things. And for me, this is very much about the acceptance of fallibility. I think I used to say a lot to young people, I learn something every time I get something wrong. That's why I learn so much every day, because I'm just getting tons wrong all the time. And, it's fantastic because I'm constantly reevaluating and thinking and changing what I'm doing. And an important characteristic of reflective practice rather than reflection is that we capture this somehow, either through a meeting, discussion, which is why I'm a big fan of supervision rather than line management in education settings, or we record it or write it down. And then as we do that, it becomes habitual, and then we can make patterns and make those connections so that we can then make change over time. And this is something we developed using a long time ago, probably 15 years ago, really, which is Gibbs's reflection cycle. And again, I think there's different ways you can apply these things. We use this working with staff through supervisory meetings, as well as working with young people on situations after trauma and stressful situations and moments of crises. But, you know, we need a system, I think, that naturally improves things as part of a solution-focused way. And I think you need to be guarded against people getting something like this and using it like a checklist, because then you create a medicalized system from something that should be more of a solution-focused approach. And so principles of this sort of reflective dialogue about listening to others rather than planning what we're going to say in advance, suspending judgment and criticism, voicing and speaking in the first person rather than abstractly, and respecting the views of the others and the rights to hold them. And this doesn't mean that you're sort of allowing extremist views and all those sort of things, you know, but it's about creating and fostering that culture where those metacognitive discussions can happen positively. And as I said before, educating the peer group for me is a massive chunk of this, you know, the wider inclusive view and cultures, you know, and these two young ladies who are in their sort of late 20s now, we're what some people might term challenging young people in school, but we're truly two of the kindest and most supportive people ever. And, you know, often those were the young people I'd want to show around people for interview, or parents or something. I say, will you show these parents around, come back in half an hour? You know, because they're the people that really know what it's like and want to say what it's like and really buy into the culture. And I think that's really important. And this is from a parental competence measure that we published a few years ago now with Professor Caroline Bond. And I think whenever I show this, sometimes there was one time where I seemed to attract somebody that enjoyed every public event, posting negative comments afterwards. I thought, I don't know whether this means that you've achieved something or whatever. Anyway, and there was often every time this slide was used, sort of saying, well, it's obvious that. And I think, well, it is obvious, but if everybody did it, I don't think there'd be a lot of the issues in how we co-produce things. And actually, you know, keeping people informed, understanding who to contact and how we do it, being honest in our communication, giving people time to communicate, not saying, oh, sorry, I've got to rush off now and teach a lesson or break duty or whatever, you know, allowing that opportunity to develop and really consistently avoiding uncertainty and misinterpretation is key, really. And so that the parental competence measure you can download off my website. It's also part of a blog I wrote called My 3-Stage School Improvement Plan, which is just all free to use, and you can just do that yourself, really. And so I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about the laser approach, which I've developed as part of my sort of ongoing training now. So this is about using low arousal approaches to support educational resilience, but this is about resilience by changing things and adapting things in the environment and the people we're working with. And I think there's a big problem, particularly in the UK, with people parking resilience within the child and it feeding into a negative model. So that's really important for me. So it's very much a focus on stress reduction, eliminating restrictive practices and seclusion, preventing a lot of these issues. And again, I think I would change my mind about that term, behaviours of concern. Now, creating that ethos of low arousal and developing that inclusive pedagogy that we've talked about. And, you know, and I think as well, it's important to know that this is possible. You know, not only did we do it where I was substantively working for 17 years, but I've helped a number of schools in different countries change their culture within these systems. So, you know, it's definitely possible. And I think, you know, we've got to believe. I think that's the key, really. So as part of our ongoing commitment, we want to try and support this with blending and ongoing coaching. It's pretty difficult during a pandemic. I know when I've been trying to do some of those coaching sessions with the London Borough I'm working with, it's been very different. But, you know, we do our best within it. And I think the sort of owning our own fragility and being quite humble about what you can and can't achieve, I think is also important within that. So, you know, I think too often I've seen in schools particularly just one training day or inset and they say, oh, everybody just get on with that. And I think the reality is that any group of people that you're doing training with or supporting, you know, you might get 95% that can just go on and crack on. You might get 2 or 3 that need a bit more support, understanding, talking things through. And some people might need some ongoing coaching or support or something modifying. But to assume that everybody can just implement something from one singular input, I think is a big issue, particularly in school settings. So I took a lot over the last 10 years about what I call high impact, low cost support. And I think a lot of things that you can do that make a massive impact tomorrow, this afternoon, whatever, cost nothing, because it's just about how you do things, and I think that there's a whole industry out there of people providing expensive training where you get a certificate, you're trained to do something, and then you've got to do this and follow all these complex things and all that. Simple is always the best for me, and I think that's the key to it. So it's about supporting this personalized approach, but drawing on these range of strategies and allowing you to implement them, how you see fit within your setting or your home. Bearing in mind, a lot of this work can be applied to where people receive education in the home, in specialist secure settings or units or mainstream schools, etc. If you want to know more about that, there's my email address. It's on the Studio 3 website. There's loads of stuff on there. There's lots of free webinars we do. If you go on to Studio 3 online at the top, and I'll perhaps paste the link later on, there's loads of stuff you can look at on that as well that we provide free of charge. Now, I don't know why I'm playing that, because I don't want to. Move on quick. There's a couple of the blogs that I mentioned with direct links, although if you go on my website, gdmorewood.com, you can see the link to Psychology, my blog, at the top there. And just to highlight a couple of things. So these are some pieces of work that we did as part of the Autism Education Trust's professional standard case studies. This is a young man, a few years ago now, this is a young man, year 7, who described secondary school as a friendly place that staff gave advice on how to calm down rather than criticising you when you have a meltdown. Now, it's not sort of terminology we'd use, but this is a young man that had been with us just for a few weeks. And I think it's interesting, his perception about how he actively knows that staff are teaching coping response, working with people within that. If people see I'm obsessed, ask me what's wrong and make me feel depressed. So again, I think it's really interesting. And Max's advice is be yourself, have lots of fun, make friends. School focuses on your mental health, your life, your happiness, equally as important as education. And I think that's where that whole school approach is really important. So you can download those AET case studies free of charge from their website, or the link on my website as well, which I think are quite interesting. And this, just as we conclude the sort of formal session, just reminds me of a couple of things, really. So this was a structure that was created by one of our students, Megan. Megan used to wear like a little woolly hat with sort of plaited bits down here, a bit like Asterix and Obelix. She made this, and the staff were getting very stressed because they wanted to take it down for young people arriving for a session, and Megan was defending it. And in the end, when I sort of got down there, we established that she wanted a picture of it. Oh, it's pretty cool. It's sort of like the Forerunners to Game of Thrones, I think. And so we had a picture of it there, and a picture of Megan by it. When we took the picture, then she took it down. And I think it reminds me, when we talk about language and consistency and good environments for learning, if you don't know the parameters in which you're working, you will never perform to your best. So if I start a race in the Olympics and I go L for leather for 100 meters, and then go, thank you very much, I've won there, where's my medal? And somebody goes, it's 1,500 meters, this, crack on. You're never going to do your best, are you? So unless we support people in understanding how we start and finish something, how we move from one thing to the other, before we're in that thing and involved in it, actually, it's going to be really difficult for some people to do their best. Yeah, so understanding proactively how we support the route through the day and the whole day I talk about here, it is really important within this. And this comes back to a blog I wrote about how we define success, in the fact that, the most successful goldfish could be the one that jumps the highest, the biggest one, the one that makes the biggest splash, the one that stays underwater for longest before it bobs up again. There's tons of ways you can define success. And I think, in education systems around the world, I think often how I would define success is very much about the route into adulthood. It's not just about academic attainment. And I think that's really important to understand. And that's why, our success was very much focused on our NEETs figure being 0, every child going on to education to training. And so nicking this shamelessly from Professor Steve Higgins, the Banana principle, it ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. What's a good investment in learning, a good investment for that child? What works in one setting might not be the perfect way to work in another setting. That's why we need to draw on these eclectic approaches and understand our communities and our schools and our settings. And that's about personalisation. But just to re-emphasise again, you can't have personalisation without structure to allow personalisation to happen. And I think, again, that's really important to understand. And I think Lisa, one of our students, sums this up quite nicely in the fact that I get to do everything my friends do. It's just sometimes everything's changed a bit so I can join in properly, and potentially defines the Equality Act in essence. And that's, our entire philosophy. We were working with, when I sort of finished at Senko, I think we had between 55 and 60 young people with education, health and care plans, most of whom were either on dual role with specialist provision or had quite significant medical and physical support requirements. I think there's no reason that population can't be educated with their peer group if we understand the values of the whole school approaches we've sort of outlined there. And so that comes to the end of the sort of formal hour, if that's okay. There's all the contact details and everything there. You can find out where everything is. And as I say, I'm very happy for Amanda to send on that as an unlocked thing, if that makes sense, as we go forward. So I do